Okay. Today we get to discuss the late 1920s, the causes of both international and domestic of the Great Depression, and the lasting legacies of the Great Depression, economically, psychologically, governmentally. Uh, the Americans that survived the Great Depression are going to be fundamentally changed, as is the federal government in the intervening years. Nothing will ever be the same. The scope, the purpose, the reach of the federal government will be forever altered, and expectations of people, of their government, are going to be forever changed. And we are still trying to deal with those facts. We're still trying to deal with the implications of the Great Depression even today. Now, we start off with the international causes, the ideas that not every American were thinking about. When we think of an economic decline and economic slowdown, the 1873, the 1893 economic slowdowns taught America that it was a national economy. But we haven't quite learned that it was an international economy as well. And so when World War I was over and economic hard times started to hit Europe, traditional liberal economic models said that you slash governmental spending and you erect protectionist tariffs. Well, that's exactly what America is going to do in response. And we're going to see a raft of protective tariffs in the 1920s, ostensibly to protect American industry, but the result was going to, well, if Europe's going to erect trade barriers, so are we. Now, what this does is basically close off American goods to the European market and close off the American market to European goods. And so nobody's thinking in the broader sense of Germany needs to trade in its industrial goods to pay off its war reparations. Britain and France need to trade in an international sphere to pay off its loan obligations to America. And in the intervening economic hard times, nobody really has a chance to figure all of that out because nobody's watching the broader scale. Nobody's looking across the Atlantic. Nobody's tracing it as an international slowdown. They're only looking at it as an American slowdown. But the real problem is going to be the nations entangled in an allied governmental debt system somewhere in the range of 26 billion. The reality is about 12 billion is owed to either public or private creditors here in America. And Europe ostensibly tries to say, well, America, you made it out of World War I without much damage, without much physical damage on your continent. You lost a few lives, but nothing on the scale of Europe. You should sort of remit all of these debts and you should erase them as a war gesture. Unfortunately, given the tone in the aftermath of World War I, whether it's Wilson or anyone else or Harding, the feeling of being duped, the feeling of being led into a war under false pretenses, or that isolationist tendency, is going to lead them to really say, no, no way in Hades are we going to remit these. You're going to pay your debts. And you're going to point to the land gains and the reparations they're getting from Germany. You should be able to repay these debts. Now, unfortunately, for a lot of people in America who are saying these things, they don't quite understand that the reparations, the $33 billion that Germany is asked to repay, is a crippling amount of money. And of course, by 1922, when the first installments are meant to be due, 2.5 billion, you simply can't pay it. You don't have the movable cash because in order to have that cash, you need to have the trade. You need to have the impacts of all of that to have money flowing through your system to accumulate. None of that is happening, so they default. Well, the French move into the Ruhr Valley and they seize coal. They seize steel. Now, that is, of course, going to destroy German economy because, well, all of the goods that they were going to sell and derive employment from and tax revenue from, that's gone out the window. But it's also going to significantly hurt the French economy as well, mainly because everything that you're relying on to rebuild your economy are the reparations coming from Germany. And as the German mark becomes, well, worthless in a lot of intents and purposes, there's horrific stories of people standing in line to buy bread as prices continue to rise in response. The closest thing that I think we can see in the living memory for us is the threat of a hurricane to the Gulf shores and watching the price of gas rise in the middle of the day. You know, while you're at the pumps, you might actually see the price of gas go up. That's the kind of situation, the hyperinflation that we're dealing with at this point. And it is this tangled web that, okay, Germany owes England and France. England and France owe America. But of course, for England and France to pay off America, they've got to get their money from Germany. At this point, Germany can't pay up. And so the spiral continues to flow. And so we almost do a little bit of circular priming of that pump. We start loaning money to Germany in the form of the Dawes Plan, and we start loaning money to them, a couple of hundred millions, and that's going to continue to go up. But it also allows American heavy industry to get into Germany to help rebuild. This is the first time that we've seen American industrial might going into Germany. But this triangular relationship of America loaning money to Germany so Germany can pay Britain and France so Britain and France can pay America really is, well, a short-term band-aid that is only going to dry up once the economic depression really starts to hit America. Herbert Hoover is going to call a moratorium in 31 over the repayment of debts, and only about $2.5 billion would ever been repaid. Meanwhile, as we go across the 20s, some of the Dawes Plan is going to continue to try to fund Germany to pay Britain and France. But in the meantime, there were also major impacts on our American banking industry because of these defaults. Now, this alone in and of itself, foreign creditors defaulting on loans to American banks, is not enough to cause the Great Depression. There are further stresses, whether it's industrial, whether it's agricultural, whether it is just underconsumption. There are stresses on a banking industry that are going to continue to get repeatedly hit over and over and over again, as everything that we'll talk about today will have a negative impact on the banking industry. And in the end, it's going to be the banking and finance industry, as the stock market crashes, that is going to have this overall all-encompassing economic factor that's driving the Great Depression further and further into the ground. But in the meantime, as we're trying to keep track, as we're trying to assess the situation, we don't have the statistical data, we don't have the economic data to really make this grand global assessment of what's coming or how to prevent it. In fact, if we're trying to analyze it today, there's still a significant amount of disagreement over what caused the Great Depression and to which element the greater factor belongs. And we'll still see a lot of people, is it more domestic, is it more agricultural, is it more industrial, is it more foreign? Historians love to argue about these ideas, and we have come to no good consensus over what the overarching cause of the Great Depression is. But internationally, the drying up of markets, the drying up of reparations payments and of loan payments certainly has a massive impact on our American banking industry, which is already going to be hurt by underconsumption. And remember, I've hammered on this point a couple of different times, is that in the 20s, everybody's going to buy. Everybody's 21, 22, 23. We're going to roar. And then once you bought it, well, you're done. Once you've purchased that car, once you've purchased that vacuum and that refrigerator, well, you're done. We keep churning them out faster and cheaper and at a higher rate, but we don't have the market, not domestically. Well, internationally, we thought, okay, well, that's the panacea, that's the cure-all. Well, China's not buying because their economy is faltering. The Pacific Rim can't make up. We're trading heavily with the Japanese, but we're going to start to see their actions in the Pacific Rim as a little bit more aggressive. And so we're going to move to take sanctions against them. And the chief market would have been South America or would have been Europe, but they're not purchasing enough because of the economic downturn to really right this underconsumption plan and problem. So, as people stop consuming, one of the key factors, and this is still a factor that we'll talk about every month on the nightly news, they'll talk about new housing starts. As there's less demand for new homes because people are seeing their disposable income start to drop finally across the 20s, well, we start building fewer homes. The houses that we have start going down in value. And if you bought it at a $200,000 note and it's now worth $180,000, you're now what we call upside down or underwater in terms of the equity you have in the home versus the value as it's being assessed. That's a dangerous place for somebody if they lose their job. Carpenters and sawmill workers and all the ancillary industries into the housing industry are going to start to see lower production. And we might cut some hours, we might lose some jobs. This starts to trickle down because of underconsumption. We're going to start to see factory production start to lay people off. And when you lose your job, well, you stop buying. So the factory layoffs and cutbacks start to come. That hits our industrial sector workers. And when you lose your job or when you are having your hours cut back, well, that means fewer wages, and that means you start to purchase less, which means the retail sector is going to see a drop in consumption further than what we already had. So it becomes a spiral. So they start laying off people. They start buying less. And so the production that keeps ramping up is going to continue to start to build inventory in stores. So we either lay people off or we stop buying. The demand for American food around the world is dropped because of the prohibitive trade barriers, particularly in Europe. And so farm prices start to fall. So that's less income for them. The problem for farmers was that across the 20s, they'd never really seen the rise in, they never saw the good days of the Roaring 20s. And so economic hardships have been hitting at them the whole time because of poor weather, because of the mechanization that they had to go through to keep competitive. And so they've bought a lot of new machinery, and as farm prices continue to go down, well, what happens when you spent an enormous amount of money on a combine harvester and now you can't make the note payment? The bank might come and repossess it. Okay, well, what does the bank do with the second-hand harvester when nobody's in the market to buy one? Same thing with the retail sector. Say that we open a new shop front and it goes out of business. Well, what does a bank do when they repossess a shop front when nobody's looking to open a new business? And across the Roaring 20s, businesses built new factories. They modernized, they electrified, they industrialized. Perhaps over expansion. And so a factory goes out of business. So the banking industry that's already hurt by foreign loans is going to see factory production go down. And maybe some of these factories close. Those notes are bad. Farm prices go. Well, you might repossess on some agricultural land or some agricultural machinery. Businesses, shop fronts, everything starts to go down. Now, again, these are all more factors that are hurting the U.S. banking industry. But one of the more critical issues for the banks is that across the 20s, the stock market had continued to go higher and higher and higher. So everyone had put their money into speculation. And for the banking industry, there's no laws, there's no governing regulations about how much depositor money has to be on hand on a daily basis. There's no regulation about what they can do with your depositor money. So they start putting it in the stock market. And at times they start buying it on the margin, meaning that I buy it in the morning, hoping, thinking that it's going to go up, and sell it before the margin comes at night, and all I do is really accept or collect profit. Well, that's great if it continues to go up, but it is one of those gambling, risky ways of investing in the stock market, and it leads to incredible volatility in the stock market. And we all know that in September of 29, the stock market crash is coming. And it's one of those great sort of myths that evolved that the stock market crash caused the Great Depression. No, the crash is the signal that the depression is there. Because what does the Dow Jones, or today the NASDAQ, what does it actually measure? Does it measure the economic viability of a company, or does it measure our impression of what that company is worth? And sometimes our impression of what those companies are worth get overinflated. And so the Wall Street crash of 29 is a market correction and a realization of the consumer, of the banking firms, of the American industrial and economic sector, that something's wrong. And it comes in phases. It was a three-phase Thursday, Monday, real Tuesday, crash. Because remember, we had to telegram, we had to telephone, we had to use paper. The trades weren't instantaneous. We didn't get instantaneous verification of all of this. So there was a lag time. But the panic begins on what's become known as Black Thursday. Millions of shares traded as people start to realize the prices start to go down. Hey, I've got all my bank's money in here, sell. And as one firm starts to sell, other firms start to sell, and it's a momentum that starts to gather. On Friday, some of the biggest brokerage houses try to buy shares. $20 million in purchases are purchased by these large firms in hopes of trying to bolster consumer confidence. But everybody's read the news on Friday of the decline on Thursday, and all of your smaller investors out in the localities, they now realize, I've got to get my money out. So on Monday, as trading opens, 13% of the value is gone. And as the panic continues, Tuesday, October 29th hits, 12% of the market is going to be lost. And so over the course of this 5-day period, you've lost $14 billion in Tuesday alone, and $30 billion for the week. Now that's a lot of paper millionaires that were wiped off the books. And in perspective, that's 10 times more than the budget of the federal government, and way more than we spend in U.S. Spending in World War I. Those are horrific numbers, and it is a black day, hence why, we've got Black Thursday, Black Monday, Black Tuesday, black, 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 as black ink is erased off of the ledgers, and your banks that had invested consumer depositor money into the stock market sees those shares penniless now, or at least worth pennies as opposed to dollars, and the value of the stocks that they have purchased collapse. Now we do have these market corrections at times, and in 1893, the stock market actually fell more than in 1929. But this has an added international component that the 1893 panic did not have. Now, we're going to see people lose everything. We're going to see people lose their homes. We're going to see people lose their businesses, and banks collapse, and industrial sectors collapse. So what does the presidency today do during these hard times? hunger, malnutrition, and you think of private charities, because the government doesn't have an active role in the welfare of its people. It never has, and it doesn't in the 1930s, or at least the late 1920s. The American Friends Service Committee, which was a nonprofit poor relief committee, they had to limit those who could get food relief. You had to be 10% under what they deemed your normal weight. And I don't know if you've checked out those normal weights, but they are decidedly pretty low. What you'll see of people who can't pay rent, what do? They get evicted. And they move into what is sometimes called Hoovervilles, because President Herbert Hoover really doesn't have an answer. And these are some of your Hoovervilles here on Central Park. You basically erect a shack on any public land, trying to get through the winter, trying to find another job, trying to find some sort of relief. If you're looking for a job, you need to find that job. There's no jobs in New York City, so what do? You hop on a train and you ride the rails to try to find a job in another town, hoping that you will find a job, be able to send some money back to your wife and your kids. But if you were unmarried, well, you don't get married because you can't afford it. And of course, the lack of marriages will see the birth rates of our population drop below what we call replacement levels, meaning for every person that dies, you've got a child that is being born. We're actually seeing the population of America for the first time in its history go down. And there is a generation of women who miss that childbearing window because they were of marriage age and child producing years during the Great Depression. And it simply was an unthinkable thing to bring a marriage and a child into the world when you don't have the money and you don't have any support for it. While all of this is going on and the Hoovervilles are starting to pop up everywhere, our federal government still has an idea that government has no role in all of this. In part because it's Hoover and his ethos, we'll talk about here in a little bit, but it's also in part because the government had never had a role in poor relief. But all that's about to change. Okay. Now, what do we do with the Depression now that it is well and proper here? Farmers, well, if you need to produce a certain amount and you need a certain amount of money to pay your note, well, the answer was to buy more land, produce more corn or wheat or whatever, so that I can make the money I need to do to pay my note. Now, that's a flawed logic. We all know that, at least now. The more you produce, well, the price goes down. The price of wheat is half of what it was at the start. Meanwhile, your property taxes, your mortgages, your loans that come due on your agricultural equipment, they're still there. And because of the international effects and because of the industrial effects and the business effects, banks can no longer float loans. They can no longer allow extensions. And so, as much as agricultural men and farmers had hated banks before, they're really going to hate them now. Because land gets repossessed and equipment gets repossessed. And it's estimated that in 1932 in Mississippi, a quarter of that farmland is auctioned off in one day due to defaults and foreclosures. Now, when we look at the factory workers, factories are closing all over the place. By 1933, we'd lost 70,000 factories. Ford Motor Company, you would think unassailable, but the Model A Ford wasn't selling like they had hoped, and so 2/3 of its Detroit labor force had been laid off, and they'd seen their sales drop to 1/4 of what it used to be. U.S. Steel places the entirety of its workforce on short hours, choosing not to lay off, but to produce less. And when we look at the industrial unemployment numbers, roughly 25% of all industrial employees are without work. And if you do have a job, those lucky enough to have that job are making a third less. Now, we've heard in 2020 of some of these pandemic unemployment numbers, and we did hear briefly about that 20% number, 25% number. It's now at 14%, and or gone to 14% and down to like 8% right now as I record this. But what did we do? We sent out a stimulus, deficit spending to keep people consuming. Don't pay off credit cards, go and buy something, encourage industry. Well, at this point, nobody's doing that. The government is not doing this. And of course, the government at this point doesn't involve itself in deficit spending at all. And the Republicans are in power. Now, if you're a marginal worker, if you're on the fringes of stable employment, well, those jobs have never been in more demand, any job, because that mindset of the male breadwinner status meant that it was deeply embarrassing and deeply shame-producing in men that they couldn't provide for their families, that they were desperate for any type of work, didn't matter what kind of jobs, any jobs, okay? Whatever had happened, they're no longer beneath the dignity of what white laborers had imagined. And so, of course, who are the first people to be laid off and who are the first people to be replaced? Black and women labor are going to be the first to be fired, to be replaced, and men are going to replace them in those jobs. By 1931, the U.S. Labor Department starts to announce something that we thought was unthinkable up until the Depression, that illegal immigrants are going to be deported. And the jobs of the traditional migrant labor, of picking fruit, of harvesting crops, of domestic cleaning, are all now in high demand. And so if the legal immigration quotas weren't enough, we're now going to start to deport illegal immigrants and really start to have deep and abiding friction between our neighbors to the south. Okay. Now, the impact on the middle class was slightly muted. If you had a job and you kept your job, you were going to do well because food prices go down. The problem for you is that you can't consume enough to make up for the other 2/3 of the economy that have no longer continued their consumption role. But you kept your home, you kept your job. Most likely you would have relatives living with you who were impacted by all of this. Today when we talk about the impact of the pandemic, and particularly on college graduates, where did they go? What did they do? Well, largely they went back and lived with their parents. Well, if you were out there in the world and you lost your job and you had odds are your family, your parents weren't alive, but your sisters might, or your brothers might. And so extended families start to live together. Now, even though you were still employed and you still had plenty of consumptive power, what did you do? You cut back. You save, because in hard economic times, I don't want to spend. Because what happens if you lose your job? Now, you don't go hungry and you don't go homeless, but what you do is have this idea, and I was a part of it when I grew up. Man, you put an iron-on patch on the knees of jeans. You kept them until there was not a single bit that was repairable left. You use it up, you wear it out, you make do or you do without. We don't go out and buy. But today, we go out and buy. They've got a small scuff mark on. I'll go buy you a new pair. That was not the case in the 20s and into the 30s. Right? And you start to can food, you start to preserve food. Now, people will start to buy patterns for clothes, and you will start to make your own clothing and tighten the belts, which of course has a continual impact on consumption, and the economy continues to spiral down. But for the middle and the upper classes, If you had a job and you didn't lose all your money in the stock market, you were fine. You would look around and you would be very anxious and nervous about the hordes of people that were on the street that were looking for jobs. You might have family living with you, extended family living with you, but overall, your economic situation was relatively stable and comfortable. What the real damage on the middle class is going to be is the psychological impact of the Depression. It is a scarring, it is a jarring impact that will have a lifespan much, much longer than anything that we think of, at least in our mind. What kind of solutions did Hoover offer? The simple answer is very little. No one really knows what to do. And everyone is trying to ascertain the causes and the solutions, but the Republican Party of the day said this was still part of our natural business cycle. In an unregulated economy, yes, you do go through these periods of boom and bust. And you go through these periods of market correction where prices come down and clear the way for new economic growth. And in that Darwinistic idea, clear out the weak of the herd and allow the strong companies to thrive. Because Hoover's own personal ethos really centered around self-help and that rugged individualistic American idea, he wanted the government to continue to remain out of the process. Okay? He wanted volunteerism. He wanted a very limited approach to government involvement, and he'll call for private funds through the President's Organization on Unemployment Relief to relieve those that are destitute and without employment or without homes. Now, what we do see is record levels of donations, but by 1932, a lot of the charities that were designed to help the homeless go out of business because they simply can't deal with the demand and cope with the scale of the problem. Now, if you're the Hoover and the Republicans, you fear that old adage of give a man a fish and he'll eat today, but teach him to fish and he'll eat for a lifetime. They didn't want to give direct relief to citizens, fearing that it would destroy their work ethic and self-reliant ideas. Hoover will send federal funds to help livestock in Arkansas, but won't help starving families. It's going to be one of the reasons that Hoover becomes the most hated man in America, and why so many people are going to target him for protests. Finally, Hoover is going to endorse limited federal intervention, and what we're going to see is a pattern that's going to develop all the way through the New Deal, is the idea of public works projects. The Grand Coulee Dam is going to be initiated, and we'll see that, and we'll see the Federal Farm Board pop up to set up loan money to co-ops and to help to buy crops and keep them off the market. And this is where we start to see some real iffy situations when people are hungry and you're withholding food. And it's one of the dichotomies when we get into the AAA of FDR, is that we're going to plow crops under when people are hungry. That's going to be a difficult one to try to stomach. But we're trying to help all segments of society, and not all segments are going to be helped by the same action. We're also going to set up further tariffs, 40% import duty on a lot of goods coming in. Now, all of this does is help to destroy the worldwide economy and prevent recovery. Okay. Well, like I said, 31, Hoover calls a moratorium on payments of World War I debt, and that was just to really avoid a collapse of the international banking system such as we know it. And we'll see Reconstruction Finance Corporation set up. And this is a last-ditch effort for Hoover as he's running for re-election in 1932 to provide banks and rail companies and insurance firms But in the end, this reinforces the idea of who Republicans care about. They care about private industry. They don't care about private citizens. And to a certain extent, that idea is still around with some of the critics of the Republican Party, is that they're more tied to big business and they're more tied to corporate America. And so that idea from the 20s, that idea from the Gilded Age, continues on. Now, what happens out in the localities? Well, protests. Farmers and industrial workers begin to take direct action. As you start to see some of these land auctions in the South, you'll actually see mobs of farmers threatening anyone who wants to buy this land. Well, the implication is going to be that they're going to be set upon by this group of farmers, and eventually setting up land auctions that result in pennies on the dollar for auctioned land. Now, part of that is that agriculture during the early 1930s was not a very lucrative endeavor, but this is an attempt for the localities to try and get back at the banks. Okay, you'll also see roadblocks set up, trying to drive the price of agricultural products up. And you start to see milk being poured out on the side of the rail lines, or cows being slaughtered on their way to market. What you're trying to do is drive the prices up. Meanwhile, communist leaders across America are saying, look, the capital system has failed. And the fear of social unrest and of maybe even a Paris-style rebellion in the 1780s coming back. This is real fear. This is very real concern about the collapse or the veracity of a capitalistic economic system. Do they really believe that it's still valid and really believe that it's still working? And so this is why the scarring impact of the Depression is so great, and why the change in the aftermath is going to be so profound. But meanwhile, we'll see more and more protests, and in particular, it'll center around World War I veterans who were promised what they called a bonus. 1924, in the midst of all the roaring, the government is going to offer a bonus in the form of bonds for every serviceman for $1 of a day of each service, or $1.25 for each day of service abroad. And these bonds will be payable in 1944. 20-year maturation period. So the thought would be this would be a good retirement bonus. This would be a nice retirement plan. And those recipients in the depths of the Depression thought, look, I don't care if I get $20 or say $200 in 12 years. You know what I need? I need $10 now. I need to eat today. My family needs to eat today. So they petition Congress to pay these early. Now it's rejected by Hoover and it's rejected by Congress. It's hard to follow the logic on that one. Meanwhile, around 1,000 veterans converge on Washington and set up again Hoovervilles. They start camping in Washington, D.C. They start camping in the shadow of the Capitol building. Hoover gives them a deadline, and when that deadline passes for them to leave, he sends in infantry. He sends in, well, tanks, and he sends in flamethrowers to burn the Hoovervilles to the ground. Hoover is rather unrepentant, protesting and demonstrating was something American veterans shouldn't do, and he was grateful that the government still knows how to deal with the mob. And these were some of the images coming from the bonus army in Hoovervilles, Brooklyn to Washington. We want our bonus. And Hooverton, normalcy and prosperity. Nobody really knows where to go. And the men camped out onto the lawn when they really have nowhere else to go, in hopes of forcing Congress, in hopes of forcing the president to listen. In the end, he's going to send a very young Douglas MacArthur in, and they're just trying to decide which way they should, I don't know, go. Or it's an odd photo, probably staged at that point, showing them, no, 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 I think they've gone this way. And the tanks are sent in to use the flamethrowers and burn out the Hoovervilles in the shadow of the Capitol building. So as 1932 dawns, Hoover sees social unrest at an all-time high, the prospect of a revolution, a very real one. And what we need is decisive action. Action of any kind, really. Doesn't matter if it's decisive or not, just action. Hoover was still hands-off, limited government action. And he's going to pay the price, as you see in this electoral map. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is going to run on a democratic platform of, we're going to try everything. Government is going to take a role. Government is going to deficit spend. We're going to help workers. We're going to help farmers. We're going to help industry. We're going to help everybody, and we're going to do it quickly. And Hoover's public persona was so bad at this point that he doesn't win his home state of Ohio. Because he's a Quaker, he is able to take Pennsylvania. But other than that, FDR sweeps the whole of the country, if you will. Okay? 6 states, and the majority of them up here garner him a very, very limited electoral college total. Okay? Now, who is FDR? One of the very rare pictures of him wearing braces and in a wheelchair. He was a blue blood through and through, related to 11 previous presidents, either through marriage or through blood. Harvard educated, Columbia Law School. Married Eleanor Roosevelt, niece of Teddy Roosevelt, who was, of course, his own fifth cousin. He had served as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Wilson, so he was a progressive. And he was the nominee for vice president under Wilson under Smith in 1920. But in 1921, he's struck down with polio. And this is something that I think we forget in our very safe American world at times, that there were still diseases, endemic diseases that we didn't have cures for, that we didn't have vaccines for, that struck people down and took them in the prime of their lives. And he was bedridden for 2 years as he struggled to regain the control of his lower limbs. In the end, he would have continued trouble walking and standing for long periods. And the majority of the American people, however, aren't going to know. Because while he recovers sufficiently to become the governor of New York in 1928, he's never photographed in braces. He's never photographed looking sick. And that was still the media having a relationship with politicians and having I don't want to say a respect for, but there being a healthy respect for the private line and public line of people in this country. Okay. Now, he's elected, but because of the Constitution, the inaugural date, he's elected and the results are known in November, and he has to wait until March 4th to become inaugurated. Meanwhile, as 32 becomes 1933, you're looking at bank closures all across the country and perhaps the collapse of the entirety of the American banking system in America prior to him coming to office. Hoover wants a little assistance. He wants maybe an endorsement of one of his plans. FDR will not assist Hoover in any way. And by March 1st, that inaugural date, most states have suspended or severely restricted banking transactions to avoid runs on banks that were becoming all too common. And by a run on bank, even today, if we want a bank to fail, if we go to our local branch and we say, I've got my money deposited here, I want it back. even Bank of America, somewhere like that. If we went on a run on Bank of America, we could seriously question their solidity. Because when you put your $1,000 in the bank, it doesn't sit there. They loan it out. So they have, at this point, these banks have no guidelines on how much subscriber money they have to keep on hand. So they may have very little. And so when people are afraid of banks and afraid of the failures, and they start going to their bank to get their money, and the banks simply don't have the cash on hand to let them take their deposits out. And so the banks could close their doors. Meanwhile, what is Roosevelt going to do on his first day? He's going to declare all of the banks closed for 4 days. On the 9th of March, he will convene a special session of Congress, and they will pass the Emergency Banking Relief Bill. They're going to send out in those 4 days inspectors to open the solvent banks and reorganize the rest. And we're going to use federal money to stabilize it. And the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation is created to guarantee deposits up to $10,000. Today, it's up to $250,000. So if you have your money in Bank of America and it fails, the federal government will guarantee your deposits up to $250,000. However, legislation is not enough. And so what does Roosevelt do? He gets on the radio. CBS, NBC, MBS. And he is going to talk to the American people. And this is when we still trusted our politicians. If the last 20 years, well, really, after Nixon, if our presidents went on the radio or on the television and told us A, B, C, or D, would we believe all of it? Odds are probably not, particularly out of the last 5 years, 10 years. But he's going to get on there with his grandfatherly voice, and he's going to tell them that the government will provide machinery to make sure the banks are safe. And then it was up for the people to trust in it. That when the banks reopen on the 10th of March, we need you to go and wait in line and put your money back in there. And that's what the American people did. And so Roosevelt is going to, in a very calm, in a very soothing voice, get on the radio and tell the American people what they need to hear and what they need to do. And over the first 100 days of his administration, what you see is an absolute blitz in terms of legislative activity and programs coming out. Does he have a coherent plan to help the economy as a whole? No. What he does have is a bunch of lawyers, businessmen, diplomats, politicians around that are thinking stuff up. How do we help farmers? How do we help businesses? How do we help banks? How do we help workers? If it works, keep it. If it doesn't, scrap it. And we're going to do all of this through economic planning and direct relief, and for the first time in American history, deficit spending. And we're going to use the credit of the American nation to get us out of this economic hole. So now once you establish your plan, what do? You go after industry. And you set up the National Industrial Recovery Act, and you pass that, creating an administration, the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, to help get industry back on track. Okay? Why are industries fighting each other? Why are they in destructive competition with each other at the bottom of all of this? What we need to do is get the large employers back to work. Okay? Set production, set prices, set wages, stabilize all of this stuff in hopes of getting employees back to work. Okay? Now, what are these logos? Well, as the NRA is administered, if you participated in these production limits and price fixings and wage increases, and began hiring people back, you could display the Blue Eagle of the NRA, not the National Rifle Association, but the National Recovery Administration. You're going to put that in your shop front window, and it shows you're part of the solution, not part of the problem. And normal citizens out are urged to boycott those not abiding by them. If they don't have a Blue Eagle, they're not worth patronizing. Okay? Now, for the most part, this would help, say today, the Walmarts, the Amazons, the Apples of our day. Okay? This would not help mom and pop. But if mom and pop only employs 10 people, how much economic recovery can they institute? So to a certain extent, this is designed to get more people back to work. And you do that by helping the biggest of the industries. And then we can work on mom and pop later. But let's get people back to work. Let's get people back to consuming. Okay? Now you also are going to see the Agricultural Adjustment Act placed out there, right? Or the AAA. Now this was designed at controlling, as you guessed it, agriculture, crops, subsidies for production on specific ones, and of course payments for farmers that would remove crops and livestock from the market. You slaughter pigs to make pig farming more profitable. You plow under crops to drive the prices up. Now this was that hard to justify aspect when people are deprived and hungry. But if you're trying to help 200 million people, some of these programs are contradictory. But we're trying to put federal money into people's hands in the best way that they know how. My great-grandparents and grandparents were recipients of AAA money in North Texas. And all the way through the 1970s, they still had a picture of FDR in their kitchen. They were lifelong Republicans, but they had a picture of FDR. That's how impactful the AAA was. Now there are people left out, the tenant farmers and the sharecroppers. They're left out of this because they don't own the land and therefore they are not the ones receiving the benefits. But we're trying to get as much money out there to as many people. And when you look at it in 34, the Dakotas saw massive spending from the AAA there, with the majority of their farm revenue coming from the government. Now we're also going to see more aspects of this alphabet soup as it becomes coined with all of these organizational acronyms. We're helping business, we're helping agriculture. Now what are we doing to help the poor? Well, we're going to put them back to work. Direct relief under the Federal Emergency Relief Agency. Okay? Civil Works Administration, they're going to do exactly what you would think. They're building works in cities. They're building stuff through the use of federal money. You're also going to see the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. You're going to take young unmarried men and you're going to put them out there doing outdoor hard labor, making trails. If you go out to Garner State Park or you go out to a lot of our state parks, the CCC built cabins, they constructed trails. They did all of this. It's part of getting people back to work and the government or the country getting a significant amount of economic benefit from it. Okay? And so reservoirs, parks, so many of the lakes in Texas were constructed by all of this. And over the course of its lifespan, you had 2.5 million people employed by all of this. You also will see $3 billion going towards the Public Works Administration. Now, bridges, libraries, post offices, and here's the Triborough Bridge up here, built by the PWA. And then the second new deal is going to see the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. Okay, so what we're going to do is put people to work spending billions of dollars, despite the government only bringing in 1.4 billion or 1.9 billion. to put people to work so that they can begin to be consumers again. Or as the Republicans would call it, supply side economics. Now, as his first 100 days conclude, there's all of these cartoons out there about, FDR here with the NRA slaying fear and dealing with deflation and conquering recoveries. But here he's got all of his little children dancing all around with the WPA and the PWA and the AAA. That alphabet soup becomes, a common sort of descriptive to talk about his first 100 days. But he's going to talk to the Congress on 15 major messages, 15 major laws passed, more programs to come online between 34, by the end of 34. But unemployment goes down from 13 to 9 million, fewer businesses failing, farm prices rebounding. Part of this is working. Does the New Deal end the Depression? No. World War II will end the Depression. But does it mitigate it and make it easier to deal with? Absolutely. Now, the moment the worst of the economic downturn occurs, that's when people start attacking FDR. The moment the fear of collapse of America goes away is the moment people start to criticize. Business leaders on the Republican side say too many taxes, too many regulations, and of course deficit spending is inherently dangerous, leads to great deficits, and well, we already know the consequences of that right now. So once we're out of the worst of the crisis by 35, that's when the critics come out. And on the right, it's business. On the right, it's the Republicans. Populists and so-called demagogues, they're going to start to criticize him on all sides. And populists meaning just those that are interested in the popular man and in the public welfare. And some of this is going to take a racial or an ethnic tone as well, as Father Charles Coughlin is going to search out in the wilderness as an Irish Catholic priest for who's to blame for the struggles of the Great Depression. And it's going to pick up on the same strain that the virulent nationalism in Europe is going to pick up on. It's a conspiracy of Jewish bankers. And a lot of conservative Catholics and his radio audience are going to listen to it. Dr. Francis Townsend, a very well-respected commentator on public health, is going to highlight the plight of what happens to the old when they can't work any longer. Now, this is a bringing in of a very European model, a socialist model of care for the elderly in old age. In Britain, they call it pensions. Well, we're going to call it Social Security here. And a much more colorful critic of the president, going to be a governor and a senator from the great state of Louisiana named Huey Long. Now, Huey, as you could imagine, as a man of the people, if you will, wants to tax the rich. And he wants to, in a very socialist way, share the wealth. And he creates the share the wealth of our society, okay, in 1934. So Share Our Wealth Society is going to be started, advocating not just the heavy taxation of those that make over $500,000. It was simply going to be the confiscation of all revenue over $500,000. $500,000 is all anybody needs to live off of in this country, and he wanted to redistribute it. Now, as you can imagine, that's a little too socialist. That's a little too communist for our American idea. But he gets a lot of traction, and he gets the word out there. Progressives and communists gain voice, whether it's student groups, labor unions, writers. It becomes fashionable to read the Communist Manifesto at universities. and in public gatherings, and confidence in the capitalist system is severely shaken by the struggles of the Great Depression. We're no longer talking about the violent upheaval and the overthrow of the capitalist machinery, but what we are starting to do is see calls for reform. Reform that some of them are actually going to come out. We will listen to Townsend. We will listen to some of the business leaders. We will even start to listen to a little bit of Huey Long, not in the fact that we're going to confiscate revenue over, but we are going to see the tax rates go up. And even opposition to FDR is going to take the shape of the Supreme Court. The NIRA and the AAA are deemed unconstitutional outside the delineated powers of Congress. And so FDR is going to have to follow that with what becomes known as the Second New Deal, as everyone starts to become more and more afraid of chaos and disorder. FDR is going to take these lessons, take these criticisms, and take all of this and shape it for the Second New Deal as he runs for election in 1936. Okay? What do we need? Security for the common man. What do we want? Well, appropriations, money, public works programs, whether it's the Resettlement Administration, where we relocate the destitute, the Rural Electrification Administration. And this will happen in Central Texas. This will happen in Tennessee, particularly the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, is the major recipient of a lot of this. But the creation of hydroelectric dams to bring electricity to the most rural areas in America. Now that creates jobs, that creates economic opportunity, again, all through government deficit spending. And of course, the youth are particularly hard hit in this economic downturn, so we start to see the National Youth Administration. But the biggest direct relief program is going to be the Works Progress Administration, and I already mentioned the WPA. Now, the WPA is a lot more pragmatic in terms of how do we employ people. Because we are going to see roads built and public buildings built and bridges and sewers and irrigation systems built. But say it's the height of a depression and loads of your musicians and academics are out of work. If you look at all of your university professors, and say if I look at history professors, are a lot of them fit to go and build roads and dig ditches and build bridges? No, they're academics. So what do? We create cultural programs. Artists create murals. Writers write local histories, write guidebooks. Historians go out and find slave narratives. Musicians, they write music and folk songs. There's so much of our 19th century history that is composed and documented and preserved by the WPA. And that's going to be a major boon for our localities and our towns and our recovery from the Great Depression. Now, we're also going to look at Dr. Townsend's recommendations for the assistance of, well, basically the poor, and the assistance of the elderly. Okay? Social Security Act is going to be passed as part of this Second New Deal, and this is the first attempt for the United States government to address social welfare of its citizens. And this was going to be a pension system funded by workers and employers' contributions that they are going to pay essentially for their own retirement, or at least a pension, as they're working their entire working life. Now, this will also create unemployment compensation, aid to benefit children and dependent children whose father is lost in the household. It's very limited compared to European models, but of course, it is the first step for an American government that is changing its idea of what its responsibilities to the American people are. It is changing all of that. Okay? Now, it does have some limitations, mainly because these contributions for the poor are more. And so I guess more impactful. If I take $100 from someone who makes 10,000, that is a significant percentage as opposed to somebody who makes 100,000. Meaning that the tax is, of course, regressive. The more the worker earns, the less he is taxed. So the burden is heavier onto the poor. And it also doesn't cover agricultural, domestic, or casual labor. And a lot of the service industries are outside the system. But it's the first time that we create a government that is going to actively take responsibility for the elderly, the temporarily jobless, or dependent children. That is a radical shift in our American government. If Washington or Jefferson could have seen this, that would have been an intensely frightening idea to them. Meanwhile, as the election of 1936 moves on, we're going to see more and more acts come online. The National Labor Relations Act, allowing organization and collective bargaining, and of course the National Labor Relations Board takes a key role in mediating these disputes. Now that sounds a lot like what Teddy Roosevelt was doing, what progressives were doing. The government taking a middle point in negotiating disputes between labor and business. So the progressives are going to see a lot of the things that they wanted out of World War I come to fruition again, not just on a temporary basis like in World War I. The election is a relatively easy victory for Democrats, carries the presidency, FDR, very easily. Democrats have majorities in the House and the Senate. And this so-called New Deal coalition of urban masses and organized labor and northern blacks carry the Democratic Party to an easy victory. Now, we're also going to benefit from the solid South, if you will, those secessionist states during the Civil War who simply will not vote Republican whatsoever. African Americans are leaving the party of Lincoln, and they are now voting, or they're voting Democrat as that party of the liberals, urban, labor. I don't want to say those that are moving in a socialist direction, but those that are moving in a much more liberal interpretation of what a government's role in our day-to-day lives are. And even if we are moving in a more socialist manner, that may not always be a bad thing. But a government that has basic responsibilities for us and for our welfare in hard economic times is certainly a good thing. Now, what have we done in terms of looking at our federal government? Well, in 1930, at the beginning of the Depression, most people outside of the post office, they would have had almost no connection with the federal government. Okay? There might have been a very light income tax, but all of the programs of the New Deal are going to radically alter our relationship with the government and the aid that comes from that government. By the beginning of World War II, 35% of Americans receive federal aid. That is an enormous shift in scope and purpose, and the government will never be the same again. Not only will people ask the government to do that, in fact, people will expect it to take an active role. And that economic role, that interventionist role, that protective role is going to continue to get bigger as we move forward. But all told, when we look at the New Deal, we feel like we know our president a lot better. We've heard his voice, we've heard his conversations, we feel like he's talking to us through the fireside chats. And we feel like the trust is back after the debacle of the Hoover years. We feel like we trust our president. We feel like, despite even criticisms of FDR, we feel like he's somebody that when he says something, we believe it. The critics of FDR would say that he has so much power and so much sweeping power that he's virtually an emperor rather than a president. And we'll start to see Supreme Court coming against, or at least ruling against, some of FDR's policies as unconstitutional, which will lead to a court-packing scandal in 1936. And I say court-packing scandal because there might be a court-packing situation coming up again. But the federal government's power vastly increased social responsibilities, financial responsibilities, regulatory responsibilities, work relief, social welfare, all done with deficit spending. That would have been unthinkable for our founding fathers. But we can also look at this and say, what did it not do? It did nothing for the South. FDR is going to need the solid South, and so when he looks at Jim Crow, he will turn a blind eye. Major criticism. And when he tried to reshape and pack the Supreme Court to 15 members, he was severely rebuked. And there is the problem of a flattening out of that recovery that some people call the recession of 1937. But in the end, people would look and say, the New Deal ended the Great Depression. No, it doesn't. There's still almost 20% of the workforce out of work when 1937 hits and 1938 hits. And we're no longer looking at domestic concerns. We're looking at the beginning of World War II in Europe and the rise of totalitarian nations there who are about to plunge the world into another world conflict for the second time in the last 20 years.